start the recording, and I will welcome Paul Goode, who is the McMillan Chair in Russian Studies, which is a new position that just started in January of 2021. And just before I introduce Paul, just a couple of words about the McMillan Chair. For those of you, some of you know Carl McMillan very well, others of you might not. Carl McMillan is a professor emeritus with the Institute of European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies. He was one of the first directors when it was back known as the Institute of Soviet and East European Studies. He spent 30 years as a professor at Carleton University and was really a critical figure in the way Canada-Soviet relationships evolved, especially in the 1980s under Gorbachev and Glasnost with his East-West Institute. Just a leader and a rock of the university, of our institute. His love of Russia stemmed from a diplomatic posting in Moscow at the height of the Cold War. And the last event he was able to give at Carleton before the pandemic was a talk to students when he talked about driving his car from Moscow to St. Petersburg in the 1950s and getting hit by a Russian truck driver and actually suing a truck driver in Moscow in 1950. And he won, believe it or not. So there's all kinds of experiences you get when you listen to Carl, and he has millions of stories like that. And it's his generosity that allowed Paul to take this position as he funded the McMillan Chair. And we did an extensive search and had candidates come in just before the pandemic. And as you can imagine, the pandemic kind of slowed things down. It took us a while to get organized, but we were delighted when Paul accepted our offer. Paul is now associate professor and the McMillan Chair. His research focuses broadly on nationalism and authoritarianism, and you'll hear one of his new directions in terms of artificial intelligence tonight. Paul is editor-in-chief of Communist and Post-Communist Studies. He's associate editor of Nationalities papers. He's got a number of positions in the field, including part of the elite sort of Ponar's research group. His book is The Decline of Regionalism in Putin's Russia, Boundary Issues, which was published by Routledge in 2011. He's guest edited special issues recently of Nationalities papers, also Social Science Quarterly. And he's been publishing like a maniac, which is a good thing because whenever you change positions, you always lose about a year in your publishing momentum, I find, and I'm sure the pandemic doesn't help. But just in the last year or forthcoming, he's published articles, or will have articles out in ethnic and racial studies, in nationalities papers, problems of post-communism, Slavic Review, and post-Soviet affairs. So it's like he's hitting every major journal in our field, and that's a real accomplishment in the last couple of years. So we're really excited to have Paul join us here at Carleton. It's a shame that he hasn't seen his office yet, although the previous occupant has still not finished the move out. So we're trying to still work that out, and time maybe is not quite the issue that it was. But without further ado, I'll welcome Paul to begin our conversation. And again, he'll speak for about 40 minutes. And after that, we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers after that. So thank you, Paul.
Jeff, thanks so much for that really kind introduction and also for the invitation to talk. And I can't tell you, all of you, how thrilled I am just to be here at AU-RUS and at Carleton, especially because it's been such a long time coming. I think I interviewed in February last year. And so here we are about a year later and finally in place. I also want to thank Leah also for organizing and for taking care of all the logistics for getting this in place. Just to let you know, this talk that I'm going to be doing today, it's very much a work in progress. I'm not really sure whether that means that in the Q&A you should be gentle or you should be ruthless. Probably either way would be fine. But just to let you know, like there's still lots of rough edges here. And one of the advantages of having this kind of format is the ability to kind of talk through some of these things, especially since it is very much something that I'm interested in. And it intersects a number of different research trajectories that I've been working in, but also takes it in a completely different and slightly uncomfortable direction. So what I'm going to do is share my screen. I've got a PowerPoint presentation that goes along with this. Okay, and I'll just sort of keep this going along. So in talking about this topic, Ghost in the Matryoshka comes from as sort of my riffing on the famous anime movie Ghost in the Shell, which sort of is a almost a morality tale about artificial intelligence. And this is not to suggest that there is some sort of mystical Russian spirit that imbues artificial intelligence. Quite the contrary. There is nothing of the sort. We do have a tendency to kind of anthropomorphize artificial intelligence, to lend it a personality. This isn't something that AI actually has, but it is something that is important to the way that people respond to it. And so that's why I wanted to kind of bring it into the equation. You can see this straight away if we look at one of the more famous statements that Vladimir Putin has made about artificial intelligence. This is in 2019. If someone can obtain a monopoly in AI, consequences are clear. They will rule the world. He then goes on to emphasize the need to achieve technological sovereignty. Now, it's possible to dismiss this kind of statement as bluster, but it's also worth pointing out that Russia has really started pushing big time into the artificial intelligence sector. And what's interesting here really is the rationale, right? It's not necessarily speed, it's not efficiency, it's not safety, it's not human rights, but it's concern, it's fear for Russia's sovereignty. And this is not the first time that Putin had stated this kind of concern. He also said something very similar earlier in 2017. Now, these other factors like speed, efficiency, safety, and human rights have gradually made their way into Russia's discourse on artificial intelligence. But the one thing that has remained constant throughout has been this serious concern for technological sovereignty. Now, looking at this, one of the things that struck me very quickly was that we don't have the tools to deal with this kind of issue. If we look at the literature on nationalism, if we look at the broad debates on artificial intelligence, nowhere is the nation to be found. Sovereignty isn't something that you find. If you look at the vast amounts, and there is no shortage of literature that's been written on artificial intelligence, there really isn't anything that talks about the implications for sovereignty or for national identities or nationalism. It's also kind of striking that the people who focus on nationalism, the broader community of nationalism scholars, haven't really devoted much attention to AI. And this is especially puzzling because nationalism as a field of study has really been built in many ways on landmark changes in economies and in technology. If you think about, Gellner's famous take on modernization or Anderson's take on print capitalism and imagined communities. Artificial intelligence promises social and economic disruption, some would say on par with the Industrial Revolution. And so it's kind of strange that nationalism scholars aren't talking about it yet. So briefly, what I want to do here is, the first half of the talk, kind of sketch out what I mean by AI nationalism as a concept, what that entails, and then dive into Russia as a case and talk about what examining Russia's push into AI helps us to understand about the dynamics of AI nationalism. In broad terms, there's two approaches that one might take, or two perspectives that one might take on understanding what AI nationalism is. On the one hand, you have a structural perspective. This is a perspective that focuses broadly on sort of the global changes that emerge from international competition in artificial intelligence. Now, bear in mind, this is not just between states. It's not just between governments. It's also between states and, say, global corporations like Alphabet or Facebook or Yandex. And this is competition that changes the basis of sovereignty. It shifts it away from the control of territory to the control of population data. Now, I'll come back to this in a moment, but this is just to give you a quick overview. The second perspective is the everyday perspective. And I've been doing a lot of work in recent years on everyday nationalism, so this is a little bit closer to home for me. But this focuses on the ways that nations are reconfigured or reinforced as artificial intelligence comes to permeate all walks of life. In this sense, nations then are reimagined not necessarily as groups, not as people, but as distinctive patterns of overlapping social practices, whether we're talking about consumption, interaction, movement, language, knowledge request, what have you. Now, what I want to do is talk a little bit about each of these perspectives in a little bit greater detail. And then I will link this a little bit more clearly to the Russian case. Structural nationalism, or AI nationalism from a structural perspective, might best be understood by starting with China, and in particular, what has been called sometimes China's Sputnik moment. There was a real surge in China's investment in artificial intelligence following 2016, when the 18-time world champion player in the game Go, Lee Sedol, was defeated by a precocious Western AI named AlphaGo. The former head of Google in China, Kai-Fu Lee, described this match as China's Sputnik moment because 280 million viewers perceived AlphaGo's victory as signaling not the triumph necessarily a triumph of machine over man, but the triumph of Western technology companies over the rest of the world. Even worse, AlphaGo went on to defeat China's own national champion, KG, in 2017. In fact, it was a measure of the match's political sensitivity that the government banned all domestic coverage, including live streams, text commentary, social media, and even push notifications. The deep anxieties raised by AlphaGo are similar to the ones that we saw earlier expressed by Putin. AI is not seen as necessarily as a human achievement, but as a national achievement, or alternatively, as a national threat. Now, breaking it down into essential components, I think scholars of nation building and state building will recognize a common kind of story here. For AI to work, it needs constant and vast amounts of data about populations. New ways of aggregating populations in terms of data has the knock-on effect of transforming the link between states and nations, such that sovereignty is no longer really about controlling territory so much as it is about controlling population data. In my paper that this presentation is based on, I have a nice elaborate retelling of Gellner's parable of megalomania and Ruritania. But just suffice it to say here that what it means in effect is that sovereignty is no longer about controlling, territory, but population data. States no longer control their own sovereignty if someone else controls their population data. For example, this is the implied threat that we have seen in reference to attempts to interfere in elections using artificial intelligence to target and influence social media. This is a direct threat to states' own control over their own population's data. This is also what drives data localization laws. Laws that demand companies like Twitter or Facebook maintain domestic servers where they operate and grant governments access to that data. The most expansive version of which being the Eurovia laws that were adopted in Russia in 2016. Now, from an everyday perspective, the entry point to this perspective is thinking about how individuals today are now surrounded by a vast array of always-on microphones and trackers. They capture everyday speech. They track daily routines. Algorithms triangulate these data that compile individual profiles. And in effect, then, AI does something inadvertent. It realizes the nationalist vision of treating every member of the nation as if they were interchangeable, not because of kinship or citizenship, but because of overlapping patterns of social practices that make for a distinctive nation. Now, where AI is weak from an everyday perspective is in understanding agency and context. As the former Russian chess champion Garry Kasparov noted, professional chess players are able to perceive the style of play adopted by AI as plainly inhuman. Likewise, humans easily detect non-human manipulation when they are contextually aware of their situation. And awareness of this manipulation can then feed sentiments of injustice and feed grievances. So putting these perspectives together, the structural and the everyday perspective, this gives us some ways of thinking about how the sources of AI nationalism can manifest. For instance, it's well known that the data upon which AI and machine learning are built often tend to import or replicate existing social biases or patterns of discrimination. especially those that are related to things like ethnicity, race, or gender. We've also found in studies of predictive policing in the United States that bad data spreads from bad precincts and it can infect clean precincts. In this way, small elements of injustices or biases or discrimination that are imported into broader population databases can feed broader grievances that could easily become a source of protest and revolt. Alternatively, we could think about the use of AIs to reward or to punish real world behaviors. An extreme example of this is China's social credit system, which in turn is built upon tightly bundled sets of platforms and an integrated data sphere. But we don't have to go to this full extreme. We could also think about the so-called nudge technologies that could also potentially apply here. Another way that one might see AI nationalism manifesting would be in the outsourcing or the exporting of AI, the exporting of algorithms or software, which risks transferring then securitized identity profiles. In other words, an AI that is aimed at monitoring the population for security threats might view, say, an ethnic minority as either an irrelevant set of data or as potentially a security risk. But when that algorithm is exported to another country, it's possible that it then similarly interprets those security threats in reference to possibly even majority peoples. China's crackdown on Uyghurs, for instance, also affected ethnic Kazakhs and Kyrgyz such that it led to concern in Central Asian states about China's access to those states' personal data. Finally, very briefly, we can think about the specific configurations and content of AI nationalism that's likely to emerge depending upon the combination of actors, whether we're talking about states and global corporations or states and subnational units, and the variety of causal mechanisms, whether we're talking about sort of like competitive dynamics or mimetic dynamics in which identities are replicated rather than challenged. Now, please forgive the shameless self-promotion here. This table actually comes from a forthcoming article in Nations and Nationalism that lays out more broadly the theoretical framework for looking at AI nationalism. So if you're morbidly curious, please do follow the link. Also, there will be a roundtable discussion of the special issue of Nations and Nationalism focused on digital nationalism on March 23rd. So keep your calendars marked if you would like to hear more about this and other approaches. But for the rest of the talk, I'm going to focus mainly just on the competitive dynamics. I'm not going to look at profiling or diffusion, although I think there's plenty that could be said with regards to those. I'm also now finally going to talk about Russia. If my PowerPoint didn't crash. There we go. Okay. Why Russia? Well, I mean, aside from the fact that Putin said that whoever controls AI will rule the world, which was kind of a big reason to look at it in the first place, right? Russia is useful from a comparative perspective as what we would call a pathway case. A pathway case study is a kind of case study that's used to elaborate abstract models. So it's not really used for testing, but rather here it's useful for looking at the different ways that theoretically these kinds of dynamics play out. More concretely, Russia is useful to study here precisely because it is not a leader in the field of AI, like, say, the United States or China. Because Russia is not in a leading position, it does allow us then to observe how these different modalities of AI development play out. Additionally, the nature of Russia's political regime as a low-capacity autocracy makes its experience potentially more relevant for understanding processes in other countries who have no hope of replicating either Silicon Valley or the Great Firewall of China. So for these reasons, Russia is useful and interesting to look at from a comparative perspective. And looking at Russia from a comparative perspective across a series of metrics, we can kind of see how it starts to line up against the leading countries in artificial intelligence. According to Oxford Insights AI readiness ranking from last year, the United States ranks first, China 19th, Russia is 33rd, so a little bit further down the pack, right? The next metric there, the Index of Future Readiness from 2017, is worth highlighting because this was produced by Valdai. And the production of this Index of Future Readiness actually was a real splash of cold water in the face of the regime. It was a real wake-up call, if you will, about the need to start mobilizing resources and to start, boosting technological capabilities. We see variation in terms of the primary source of investment, whether private-led or state-led. Also in terms of the nature of the population data ecosystem. I'll return to that later on. But one of Russia's major advantages is human capital, and you can see it falls between the US and China here on this metric. Also worth noting is the relatively low level of the economy that was effectively digitalized as of 2017. Now, Russia is attempting, as of effectively since 2019, attempting to bootstrap its way into global leadership in AI, but it's doing so with limited resources. To give you a sense of the scale of the disparity in resources available, in Russia's AI strategy from October 2019, it foresaw investing about 90 billion rubles over 6 years. That amounts to about 1.4 billion US dollars. By contrast, just 2 provinces in China have already invested about 15 billion US dollars. So there's a vast amount of territory in terms of resources that Russia still has to make up to catch up with what China is spending, much less the US and other Western countries. However, if we look more broadly in a comparative perspective, and this is the heat map of the AI readiness ranking, we can also see that Russia actually isn't that far off from countries like China, India, or countries in Central Europe. In other words, it is at least plausible that Russia could catch up to leaders in AI within, say, a decade's time. Now, turning to the drivers of Russia's push into AI, it's interesting that concerns over preserving national culture and state sovereignty really are prominent. Now, this quote here, I should note, is not from presidential spokesperson Dmitry Peskov. It's a different Dmitry Peskov. But this was stated in sort of the meeting of the Agency for Strategic Initiatives, specifically to Putin. We need to have our own national AI, which can promote and translate our values, followed by a little morality tale about what happens if IBM teaches our kids how to sing. Last year, Putin warned that it was urgently necessary to develop Russia's high-tech industry if Russia hoped to preserve its civilization. And earlier this year, Putin complained in a virtual meeting at Davos, about digital giants competing with states and the need to reinforce state strength. Taken together, these tell a pretty common tale, right? There is something that is definitely driving Russia's push into AI, and not just the need to invest, but the specific manner in which it is investing. While lacking the capacity to invest on a scale to match either the US or China, Russia does have some competitive advantages. Its competitive edge stems in part from an inherited system of domestic intelligence gathering, the SORM system, which has now been exported to some 26 different countries. It has also moved aggressively, as I mentioned earlier, to implement data localization laws and taken measures to disconnect the country from the internet if need be, the so-called sovereign internet. It has also accumulated a lot of experience over the last couple of years in Moscow with facial recognition and smart city technologies. Also with the use of legal sandboxes to fast track their implementation. And finally, it has started to move aggressively in higher education to turn the country into a destination for training new generations of experts from all over the world. In other words, really trying to emphasize the human capital advantages that Russia possesses. Despite this seeming advantage, a closer inspection of Russia's actual investment in AI tells perhaps a slightly different story. If we look at state procurement data, and this is publicly accessible open access data, looking at states' procurement in AI-related technologies suggests that Russia is still very much focused on building infrastructure. So the vast majority of orders, for instance, were concentrated in largely ambiguous categories, like information systems or automated systems. There were only modest increases from 2014 through to 2020, for things like safe region or smart city technologies, for traffic management and law enforcement, database orders. Likewise, the kinds of technologies most directly related to artificial intelligence innovation appear to be in the least demand: algorithms, robotics, smart systems. Now, you can interpret this a variety of different ways, and one possible way to interpret it, for instance, would be that using ambiguous buzzwords like information systems or automated systems is a good way to, spend money, um, or at least to transfer money from point A to B. It could also be that there is actually sort of a lack of consensus about what is necessary for building infrastructure. Now, acknowledging the gap in Russia's AI development, the national strategy that was adopted in October 2019 makes explicit reference to the need to both protect technological sovereignty and to expand its reach abroad. Now, key to this is the creation of a unified population data set, as well as a proprietary hardware and software platform for accessing and managing it within 10 years' time by 2030. Now, this is very much a state-led strategy and is built on using in-house data and technology that hasn't yet been invented. So Russia has basically taken a decisive step towards sort of a China model of AI development, a state-led model of AI development with almost a hermetically sealed data sphere as the basis for development and implementation. This has also then moved Russia into competition with Western states and global corporations who would like to move into the same market space. The wild card in all this then is how the collection and management of Russia's population data intersects with the way that Russian politics works, and whether that amplifies or mitigates the risk that access and management of population data will be manipulated or even subverted. For example, journalists discovered not long ago that access to Moscow's facial recognition network could easily be purchased on the black market via online chats and forums. So there are ample opportunities potentially for abuse and corruption. One significant source of potential source of subversion comes from patronage opportunities. In other words, the vast growth in spending and investment in AI is potentially a gravy train for the elite, for the apparat. Perhaps indicative of the sector's patronage potential, Putin's own daughter was appointed to lead a new AI institute at Moscow State University with starting investment of $59 million US. Now, while the previous figure about state procurement numbers suggested a steady and measured increase in state orders involving AI-related technologies over time, this somewhat conceals the the sector's full patronage potential, right? Because the volume of orders doesn't necessarily scale with the volume of contracts ultimately signed to fulfill them. In fact, when I initially calculated the orders and the contracts, I had made the mistake of artificially capping the total value, which made them look far less significant than they were. If we look at the total value of contracts actually signed since 2014, we can see that there was a pretty significant bump after 2017, right? So after Putin's, he who controls AI will rule the world speech, suddenly there's massive investment in AI. You see the amount more than doubled to 215 billion rubles. And this is in fact more than 7 times the expected commercial market was for 2020 already. Now it's much harder to say whether these values actually reflect investment or if they conceal soaring patronage. And certainly you can't exclude the latter. Based on a cursory inspection of a sample of the bidding on individual deals, you can say at least a few things at a minimum. Regional governments have ample opportunities to exploit oversight positions, to steer the awarding of contracts to local companies or to local oligarchs, and to push back on attempted incursions by companies based in Moscow or in St. Petersburg. And in doing so, to create opportunities to drive up the overall value of state contracts to their advantage. This is not to say that I have hard proof that there has been exploitation of this new investment stream for patronage, but there are a lot of things that point in that direction without looking at a more systematic level, but that's coming. As I said, this is a work in progress. Now, a second source of potential subversion has emerged in the form of regional disparities in terms of technological capabilities and readiness. And this has been vividly highlighted by the effects of the pandemic over the last year, and especially in the first half of 2020. In January of 2020, one of Russia's premier facial recognition companies, Intech Lab, identified more than 200 Muscovites who broke mandated self-isolation regimes after foreign travel. Considering this to be a successful trial run of their technology, Sberbank and Rostec then were quick to use the pandemic as an opportunity to try to expand their reach beyond Moscow. Rostec's CEO, Sergei Chemezov, even contacted all regional leaders directly, offering to help them install similar facial recognition systems to fight COVID-19. But things got hard when the rubber hits the road, right? Implementation strained under the new mandates that were imposed by the Kremlin. The surge in mobile network usage alone highlighted deep infrastructural weaknesses and extreme regional variations in technological capacity outside of Moscow. The financial impact of the pandemic also had a knock-on effect on investment, as orders fell off steeply during the first part of the pandemic. However, it also focused attention on those weaknesses. It focused attention on the need to start, addressing those weaknesses in the infrastructure, and investment quickly recovered by the last quarter of 2020. In fact, the lessons learned from the pandemic is now frequently cited as driving the newly adopted federal project for implementing the national AI strategy. Although granted, the funding for the federal project, is actually about 3 times less than what was originally planned. Okay, so I've got just a couple minutes left, so let me sum up for you. Russia's case demonstrates the salience, I would say, of AI nationalism. Nationals' fears about losing cultural distinctiveness and state sovereignty really pushed Russia into adopting a state-led form of AI development. And Russia's AI strategy reflects both structural and everyday sources of AI nationalism. But the move to state-led development has not been without problems. It has also stimulated competitive domestic dynamics. Now, Russia now appears to have gone all in on AI as the key to its future. And certainly, it's not alone in this regard. As Kasparov observed in his book, Deep Thinking, fighting to thwart the impact of machine intelligence is like lobbying against electricity or rockets. For scholars of Russia, for scholars of nationalism, it's something that we have to start taking seriously. And frankly, there's little choice in the matter. Thank you very much for listening through, and I look forward to your questions. So, Jeff?
Thank you very much, Paul, for your talk. And I'll just let people know that you are welcome to either use the raise hand function to ask questions, or you can post them in the chat, and I'll be happy to read them afterwards. Are there any questions now at this point? I know always asking the first question is always a bit of a challenge for people.